Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final event of Brazil Week. I think, in my opinion, probably the best and most exciting. We have Damian Platt with us to present his new book, Nothing by Accident, which I've read this week, and it is very, very good, very insightful, and really offers a whole new understanding of the troubles that Rio goes through. Before we start, I just want to outline a little introduction for Damian and the good work that he's done over the years in Brazil and within other areas too. So Damian studied modern languages at Edinburgh University. He subsequently then spent 18 months working with the Redemptorist Catholic missionaries in Tocantins, which is in the northern interior of Brazil, about 12-hour bus ride from the capital, Brasilia. From there, he then spent 8 years working at the International Secretary of Amnesty International in London, and also did work during this period in Brazil as well. In 2005, he relocated to Rio de Janeiro to work for Afro Reggae, which is a favela-based youth and cultural organization, which is actually something, if I may say so, got me involved in Brazil at the age of 17 when I watched this DVD myself, and was really quite inspired by the work that was going on with Afro Reggae to try and curb violence in that community. He then later went on to write a book called Culture is Our Weapon with Patrick Neate, and then teamed up with TED Prize-winning artist JR on his work on Women Are Heroes project in Rio, which projected different pictures of women's faces, women's eyes across some favelas in Rio. From there in 2019, he then mobilized a team of local and international volunteers to build a world-class skate park in the favela of Maré. And then in 2011, he was awarded an MBE by the Foreign Office of the British government for services to community development and human rights in Rio de Janeiro. Above all this, he is also a qualified teacher and has taught in the UK in 2018. So as you can see from this brief introduction, he has a vast experience in Brazil, has done an amazing amount of work, and it's our pleasure here at King's and as Brazil Week to actually listen to this talk about his book and listen to the insightful knowledge that he has. So what I'll do now is I'll pass over to Damian, and I'm really looking forward to listen to this presentation myself. So thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. And thank you to the Brazil Institute at King's for asking me to talk. It's an honor to be speaking at your 10th anniversary. And I'd like to say also thank you to Vinicius and Anthony Pereira as well for having me along. I thought it was interesting that the Brazil Institute is 10 years old because the work I did in my book spans pretty much the same period in the history of Rio and Brazil. So it really goes from 2009 to 2019. So what was a fascinating decade for Rio and Brazil. And I was thinking what Anthony said in his opening talk on Monday about the massive changes that Brazil has been through. So 10 years ago, as a very strong, vibrant, emerging power and economy with the world's attention focused on it, to today a country that's sort of flirting with authoritarianism and is definitely not as strong as it once was, and how this has been a sort of quite fast change in fates for Brazil. And so what I hope to achieve with my book and with today's talk is helping people perhaps to understand a little what went on in the past decade. I focus on a specific situation and a specific city, which is Rio, but I hope that it will also offer sort of light onto the situation in Brazil as a whole during this period. And I thought one quote that Anthony gave in his talk, which was, I thought pretty interesting. He said, "A lie will go around the world while the truth is putting on its boots." And I think very much what I was trying to achieve with this book was facts and a reading of what is happening in a city which is very often misrepresented and misunderstood. And the book essentially is the result of my efforts to decipher the events that were happening in Rio during the time I was there. And what I've got today is a PowerPoint, and I'm going to present that, and then we can have some questions. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the history of my work, how I began to do what I was doing, how I moved to Rio. And then in the middle, I will talk about how I tried to understand more how the city fitted together. And I tried to look a lot at what was not discussed, so what was not in the media, and what people weren't talking about. And part of that was I got tired of people just focusing on favelas, talking about favelas the whole time. So I decided to look outside that and at one aspect of Brazilian culture, which is an illegal but very popular lottery called the Jogo do Bicho, which in England would be the animal game, which is about 130 years old and has been illegal for most of that time and underground most of that time, but has been a very powerful influence in how the city works, how relations are managed in the city. And finally, I'm going to try and draw some of the matters I talk about together to ask us what they can tell us about the murder of Marielle Franco, who was a very well-known human rights defender and a very popular person in Rio, who was killed in a very professional assassination in 2018. And she's since become very famous, unfortunately, after her death, but also very powerful in that the events surrounding what happened to her and subsequently also tell us a lot about Rio and Brazil today. So I'm going to start off, I'm just going to share my screen and go into a PowerPoint, so I hope that works okay. And just bear with me a second. Okay, so that's the book cover, and as you can see on the cover, we're looking at posters. These were posters that Amnesty International pasted around the center of Rio in 2019 for the anniversary of Marielle's death. And you'll notice that what they say is "Quem mandou matar Marielle," which means who ordered the killing of Marielle, because at that moment in time, the gunman had just been taken, the alleged gunman had just been taken into custody and were in prison. So this was looking at the bigger question of who was behind the murder, which is something that I hope the book will help to explain. So just to go back a bit in time, in about 20 years ago, I was working at Amnesty International on the Brazil desk, and focus of our work was the criminal justice system. And we looked at prisons. We did a lot of prison work, looking at prison overcrowding and torture within the criminal justice system, but also police violence. And in 2003, we produced a report which was about police violence and impunity in Rio. And it was around this time that I started to spend more time in Rio, visit the city more, and building up a network of contacts and getting to know people in the city. I also, as part of my work at Amnesty, I began to realize that in order to understand what was going on, I couldn't take events at face value. Part of the job, if you're doing research on a situation for human rights research or a job like Amnesty International, you need to look very closely at what happened to try and understand what exactly is behind events. So this is a case that happened quite early on in my time at Amnesty, which was when supposedly police had intercepted a bus full of criminals who was allegedly on their way to steal money from an aircraft that was bringing cash to a small airport in the interior of Sao Paulo. It wasn't even in the main city. So allegedly, these police intercepted criminals on their way to rob this aircraft. And it was presented in the media as a massive blow against organized crime. It was presented as a great victory for the man in charge of the police and for the governor of Sao Paulo at the time. But when an investigation took place into what actually happened afterwards, it emerged that it had been a setup in that there were police infiltrated in a group of people, and that the police had organized that group of people to get onto a bus, inform them that they were going to go and rob, take part in a robbery and make easy money. And it became very quickly apparent that what had actually happened was an orchestrated crime organized for the purpose of making it look like the police were being tough on crime, and to give the governor of Sao Paulo at the time political points. The quote there is from the public prosecutor's office in Sao Paulo, which helped this information come to light. The police only went to trial in 2014 and they were all acquitted, which is quite common in cases like this in Brazil. But the facts came out all the same. And it was an event that marked me, and that I realized I needed to look very closely at what was happening. And I sort of applied that knowledge later on to working on Rio. And it's sort of this outlook that has informed the way I've engaged with Brazil over the years. So I've had a sort of analytical outlook, but once I moved to Rio in 2005, I had a more grassroots outlook. So it's a combination of those things: working in communities affected by violence, but also from above, trying to understand the broader context of crime, criminality, state abuses within that context. So working at Amnesty, I've made regular visits to Rio. This is in 2003 as well. This is visiting the favela of Borel, which is in Tijuca. And there was a case where 4 men who weren't involved in crime in any way were killed by police who had sort of hidden themselves to ambush them inside the favela. And it became Amnesty adopts emblematic cases. So it was a case that we had adopted because the men had merely run away when there was a police operation to try and hide, and they were shot and killed from above by a group of police. So here we are visiting the community with the Amnesty International Secretary General at the time. And I'm on the left, and just on my right in the white shirt is a man who at the time was our key contact in Rio and who helped us organize our activities. And he went on to become a state politician and a federal politician. Now he's one of the most prominent left-wing politicians in Brazil. He sits in federal government. His name is Marcelo Freixo. He's also an important person to know in this story, because Marielle Franco began her political career working in his office, and she followed in his footsteps. He originally worked in the Human Rights Commission for another state politician, and then embarked on his own political career. And Marielle was doing the same thing when she embarked on her own political career in 2016. So in 2005, I moved to Rio. I left Amnesty and I went to work with Afro Reggae, as David mentioned. I wrote a book about their work. This was a grassroots organization working in favelas, working with youth, at-risk youth, getting them engaged in cultural activity, and also working with a lot of conflict mediation between gangs, and basically occupying space within these communities, which I realized at Amnesty, they were very much cut off. They were very hard to get access to. And Afro Reggae at the time was a very interesting group. It could move around all the favelas in the city. So I moved to Rio and worked with them for several years. And then I moved on to work with other projects. This is one that David mentioned as well. This was with the French artist JR as part of his global Women Are Heroes project. And it's definitely one of the most fascinating projects I've worked on, because it involved various levels of community engagement. So we went in without knowing anyone. We made friends. We learned about the women. We learned their stories. Then we asked permission to take their photos. Then with those photos, we turned it into a giant art installation. And it was very life-changing for me, because I became very good friends with a lot of people in this community. JR bought a house inside the community, which we turned into a cultural center, which is called the Casa Amarela. which is still operational today. You can find it on Instagram, find it on the internet, and it's just reopened now after COVID. It offers activities for the community. It brings world-famous artists into Providencia. And what was interesting when we went into this favela was they said, oh, no one ever comes here. No one's been here for years. Like, we're quite forgotten. And it's interesting because it's the first place in Brazil where the word favela was used to describe an informal settlement in a city. So this was the first place actually called favela, and it then became known as Providencia. I spent several years working here first with JR and then as a volunteer, and then engaged in other projects. During this time, I also got to know a lot of the human rights community. In Rio, it was a small, tight-knit group of people. Everyone knew each other. You would see each other at meetings. Marcelo Freixo used to hold a lot of meetings at the house where I lived as well. So I'd already knew him from my Amnesty days and spent a lot of time with him and his team. And one of the people on his team was Marielle. So in this photo, you can see her. That's a photo I took in 2011, where she was representing upper funk, because at the time there was a lot of criminalization of funk music, which is very popular in the favelas in Rio. And this was at an event at the time organized by Mayor Pais. And if there's any good news in Rio recently, it's been that Mayor Pais has recently been elected mayor again. Not that he's Superman or the best politician in the world, but that he's very good for culture in Rio. He has a genuine love for the city's music and its cultural expressions. And this was at an event that he had organized in 2011. So Marielle was a person I saw regularly and spent lots of time with in my years working in Rio. Here's another photo taken at the top of Providencia. I like this photo because it's taken at the top of the first favela, looking out over the city. In the distance, you can see Christ the Redeemer. You can see the trains that go out to the suburbs. And you can see, in fact, the Sambadrome where the carnival parade takes place is just in the middle left of the picture. And I like the idea that these kids are up there looking out at the city. And it was at a time in Rio where I was tired of focusing on the favela, and I was tired of hearing this endless discourse about favelas, crime, violence, gangs, which there was always a fundamental problem with this, was that it put the favela at the center of the problems as a source of problems, or as a source of criminality, when really it's just one element in the city. It's just one part of a very complex city, and a situation as well that involves lots of different actors at different levels. And the favela is just one component of life in Rio de Janeiro. So why were people always talking about the favela as if everything bad emanated from these communities? So I began to look more broadly at the city to try and discover other aspects of life in the city. And that's what led me to start looking at the Jogo do Bicho. And why is this important? I think just to remind us that to understand the circumstances which led to the murder of Marielle and facilitated the murder, where you had a group of highly organized gunmen acting with what they saw as impunity, fairly certain that there was going to be no consequences for what they did. It's very important to understand how organized crime operates in the city, across the city, not just inside the favela. So to do this, as I said in an introduction, I began to look at a lottery, a very popular lottery, which has been illegal for over nearly 130 years. And it's fascinating because the lottery emerged at the time when Brazil was emerging. It was about the time when the new republic had been declared, the new Brazilian constitution had been written, and it was the birth of Brazil, basically. So at that time, there was an entrepreneur in a neighborhood called Vila Isabel who opened a zoo. and he wanted his zoo to be as good as any European zoo. He wanted the neighborhood Villa Isabel, where he built his zoo, to be as one of the best neighborhoods in any city in the world. So he opened a zoo, and part of the way he wanted to raise funds to keep his zoo going was he invented a lottery, and visitors to the zoo would buy a ticket for the zoo, and it would have an animal printed on it. At the end of the day, there would be a draw, and if you had a winning animal on your ticket, you would win a cash prize. So it became very quickly very popular, and it drew the attention of the authorities, who were concerned about the moral implications of this. And very conservative authorities didn't want a gambling fever to take grip in the city, so they banned the lottery. What happened? It just went underground. People started organizing their own draws in other places in the city, and the lottery went underground, which is where it stays today. It's quite fascinating. It's based on 25 animals. There are 25 animals because each animal is linked to a group of 4 numbers, which means that you can fit 25 in around 100. It has 4 daily draws today. You can buy tickets on any street corner in the city almost. On the left is actually a results slip, and you can see on the right those are results which are pasted up on streets and corners around the city. So it's immensely popular. There are 4 draws a day, Monday to Saturday, and there's 1 draw on a Sunday. So it's 7 days a week. I think the only days it closes, I'm not even sure if it closes on Christmas Day. It closes at Carnival. And there's a reason for that, which I'll come into later. But that's the only time in year when I'm aware that the lottery stops. So it was underground from the beginning, from the end of the 19th century. The beginning of the 20th century, it carried on growing in popularity and gradually became sort of absorbed into the culture of the city. It was always illegal, which meant that quite quickly a system of bribes and favors grew up around it, with certain police and politicians acting in favor of people who were selling lottery tickets. Then in 1946, federal government banned all forms of gambling in Brazil, including the lottery, which was already illegal, but they added other forms of gambling. So casinos, bingo, and it's quite important because eventually the people who organized the lottery also took over these other forms of gambling. So today, the people who run this lottery in Rio also run gambling. So they run casinos, bingos, electronic gambling machines. So it's a massive illegal market that generates huge revenue and also an enormous amount of money and bribes available to police. And this is just a short clip that I'm going to use from a film called The King of Rio, made in 1984. And it describes 20 years in the life of the Jogo do Bicho. So 20 years in the life of this lottery between 1964 and 1984, which was actually the military dictatorship. In the clip I'm going to show you, you will see a meeting taking place in what's called a fortress, which is where the Jogo do Bicho bankers would keep their bets, keep their money, their weapons, because by this time it was becoming dangerous and they were starting to fight for control of different territories in the city. And an old Jogo do Bicho banker, as they're called, they're also known as bicheiros, taking their name from Jogo do Bicho. This old banker has learned that a younger upstart banker has stolen some money. He hasn't just stolen any money. This is a young, ambitious banker he's socially mobile, and he wants to marry a girl from a rich family. So he's tried to get her a lovely ring. And to do this, he's stolen money from his boss, but he hasn't stolen any money. He's stolen the money that is for the police. So they have a meeting. The banker already knows what's going on. So the younger banker tries to explain his way out of it. Well, the older banker tells him, I know what you've done. You've stolen the money for the police. And I'll just play this scene. I've given a translation of what he says on the right, but hopefully you can hear this fine. Whoops.
Isto aqui existe porque existe a lei. Ele do lado de dentro e nós do lado de fora. Não é?
So just to explain quickly, what you've got, the Jogo do Bicho banker is standing in the middle with his men around him. The person sitting on the left at the bottom is in fact the head of Rio's police. So it's very interesting, this scene, because it's clear that the hierarchy, it's very clear who is in charge. The Jogo do Bicho banker is in charge, and he's explaining this exists because the law exists, him on the inside, and you hear he just refers to the policeman, and the policeman never speaks, he just assents. And it very clearly demonstrates the power structure that was perceived to exist between the Jogo do Bicho and the police in the city of Rio.
É paixão. O dinheiro da polícia é sagrado porque é um acordo entre cavalheiros. Assim como o que a gente tem com os apostadores, que acertam na dezena, na centena, no milhar. E a gente paga. O jogo do bicho é uma coisa baseada na honestidade.
So I can highly, what he's saying is the Jogo do Bicho is based on honesty, which is the word, you know, you say the word, we pay the police, we keep our side of the bargain, the police will keep their side of the bargain. I highly recommend this film if anyone can get access to it. It's called The King of Rio. It's absolutely fantastic piece of Brazilian culture. So just to carry on a bit and to help emphasize the influence of these organized criminals in Brazil, I also conducted interviews with several police. This is an interview I conducted with a civil policeman, a well-known civil policeman who himself had to receive protection in Rio. And he explained to me that they'd been there from the beginning of the Brazilian Republic. So I'm just going to read this out loud. So in every stage of the history of Republican Brazil, the guys are there, from civilian dictatorship to the military dictatorship in a democracy and under re-democratization. Why? Because they play the game. What does political power want? You want an information network for a military dictatorship? Here you are. You want money to finance campaigns? Here. And I'll carry on with my business over there. If you go deeply into this, at the very minimum, you'll be studying the history of the Republic, or better, the history of Brazilian politics since the proclamation of the Republic. The history of organized crime in Rio de Janeiro and Brazil begins with the Bicheiros. The first criminal organization in Rio de Janeiro and Brazil is the Bicheiros, but there's no organized crime without the state. It penetrates the state. In our case, it confuses itself with the state itself. You get to a point where you don't know what is the state and what is a bicheiro. And this is fundamental to understanding the importance of this issue. It's completely enmeshed and entrenched inside the state, so that it's not clear anymore where one thing begins and where one thing ends. During the 1960s and the 1970s, the bankers, the men who ran different territories in the Jogo do Bicho, started dividing the city up into territory, particularly during the 1970s. And each territory had a banker who ran that particular part of the city. And eventually they formed a managing committee of Bicheiro bankers who also took control of Rio's carnival. Now, what was their involvement in carnival? They got involved in carnival. They've been involved since the 50s when they started funding Rio's samba schools. Samba schools are the huge collectives that you see in the carnival parade. So when you see a parade with the drummers, the floats, the dancers, the costumes, that is a samba school. And they're very important because they're essential elements in Rio's social fabric. Every neighborhood has a samba school. The really big ones are massively popular, followings of thousands. They exercise great influence within the communities where they exist. So the local bicheiros would start acting as patrons of the samba schools, which needed money. They'd invest in them. And when it came to the carnival parade, they would compete with them. And they used the samba schools as a sort of cloak of respectability to give them social legitimacy and also popularity. And this photo is actually taken at the Sambadrome, and it shows Castor de Andrade, who is perhaps the most famous Jogo do Bicho banker of all time. And he's obviously celebrating a victory. And what's particularly important about the photo is the two policemen on either side of him, who are his security men. They're not just policemen who happen to be at the Sambadrome. This is a well-known figure in organized crime in Rio with his security, who are actually uniformed policemen. And just to give you an idea of the contemporary relevance, this is when I looked up, if people want to learn a bit more about Castor de Andrade, you can go on the internet. People who speak Portuguese, you can find an interview, him talking to Jô Soares, who's a famous talk show host. And I just had a look, because I hadn't looked for a while, and I found this was a few days ago, so this comment was made a month ago, and this is a woman who's written, without knowing this man, Castor, he sent me a 15th birthday present because my father worked for him as a bicheiro. He asked what I wanted, and I said I wanted a sewing machine. Today, I'm a senior fashion designer. And what's really fascinating is the answer. Someone has written, yes, I've got no doubt about that. If you put a statue of Castor on the pavement in Bangu, which is the neighborhood in Rio where he came from, where he was his power base, money will come out of it. So this is in 2020. This is a man who died in 1997, and people are still talking about him as this folkloric figure who could make magic things happen and who could make money appear from nothing, which is really what he did for the local community. That was how he was seen. Well, what sort of money was it? This is to give you an idea of the actual, what the money was, where the money came from, where it was going. So Castor was very influential in a moment at the end of the 1980s when electronic gambling machines came into Rio. They were legal for a short time, and the bicheiros took over the importing. They were made illegal shortly afterwards. That's something you'll find in the jogo. 1 minute something's legal, 1 minute it's not, but they're generally nearly always illegal. And in this case, they were recycling, laundering mafia money through the electric gambling machines. And this actual quote is being given in an Italian investigation called Operation Malocchio in 1999. And an informer who was subsequently shot dead in Caracas a few years after making the statement was explaining that in Rio, there's a cupola, so there's a managing committee for the Jogo do Bicho. And he said it's the cupola as we understand it. So very much a mafia structure. So not only have you got this mafia structure powerful in Rio, it's well known abroad. It's a mafia that cooperates with mafia in other countries. And in fact, it's known that the Jogo do Bicho had links with the Sicilian mafia and the Corsican mafia. And this was through Castor de Andrade. Something important to understand as well is that the first generation of bicheiros are very old now, most of them in their 80s. Castor de Andrade died in 1997. This generated a terrible dispute in his family for the inheritance. And in this case, what we're seeing is a car bomb that took place in 2010, the same time I was starting my work on the Jogo do Bicho. And someone had tried to blow up Castor de Andrade's nephew. What was going on in the family was a power struggle. Castor's son had already been killed, and his nephew and son-in-law were fighting over the family inheritance. This is another historic and iconic image in the history of Rio crime. On the left, you have a bicheiro who's called Maninho Garcia, and he's at the funeral of another legendary bicheiro banker. And this is sort of, he's sort of Jogo do Bicho royalty here at this funeral. And Maninho was allowed, he was godson of this Jogo do Bicho banker who had just died, and he is here in the 80s at his funeral. Why have I talked about Maninho? Maninho was a powerful person. He was the son of an original Jogo do Bicho banker called Miro Garcia. The Garcia family ran the whole Jogo do Bicho and gambling business in Rio's south zone. So in the richest, most middle class, most affluent bit of Rio, the famous bit where Copacabana and Ipanema is. This family was so well established that they owned stud farms, they bred horses. In the bottom right, you can see one of Maninho's daughters. Actually, she was well known in equestrian circles. Maninho was killed in 2004. This also generated a very violent family dispute over his fortune between his two twin daughters, who are in the top right, on either side of the mother, who's in white. And that dispute has gone on now for some 15 years almost, and has led to numerous killings. The reason why I drew attention to the Garcia family dispute is because whenever I was studying it, while I was studying the Jogo do Bicho, I heard about a very shady gunman who was a former BOPI police officer. The BOPI are Rio's elite police, their commando unit. They're famous all over the world. Films have been made about them. They're extremely violent, and they were famous for being the fearless police who would go into favelas to fight the criminals in the favelas. This particular gunman had left the BOPI and worked for the Jogo do Bicho as a hitman, and his name was Captain Adriano. I just want you to remember that name for a minute. His name is extremely important because, again, he is a character who helps us understand the circumstances that led to Marielle's killing. So just to recap, to understand Rio, you need to understand the Jogo do Bicho, because it is a whole powerful, unofficial operating system that operates outside the law and runs organized crime in the city. All the things I've talked about, the fact that they're patrons of Carnival, it's well known who they are. These are all very well known facts. They're all in the public domain, but they're never discussed, which is, as I explained at the beginning, when I started trying to understand Rio, I started trying to look at what was not discussed in order to understand the city better. And I think fundamentally, if we're going to talk about Rio without talking about the Jogo do Bicho, it's like talking about Sicily without talking about Cosa Nostra. It's that important. And it baffles me that people have gone to Rio de Janeiro, people write books, people make films. There were the Olympics, there was the World Cup, and everyone still comes away with the same narrative about gangs and favelas and drug gangs and, you know, being terribly awful, and, you know, they all come from these poor communities and we need to police them. It's a lie. And so I'm thinking back to what Anthony said, a lie will go around the world, and these lies have gone around the world. So what I'm hoping to do with this book is to readdress some of these facts. To understand the lie, we need to understand the Jogo do Bicho. We need to understand people like Captain Adriano, where they come from. So just to get back to Marielle, after she was killed, there was a sort of hurricane investigation that took place, and a fellow politician who worked in the city council of her was blamed with the murder. And he was said to have worked with a military policeman to have organized Marielle's murder. This quickly became clear that this wasn't actually true, and that the people believed to be responsible for the murder were in fact members of a death squad called the Crime Office. The founder of the Crime Office is the man believed to be the man on the left, Captain Adriano. The man who fired the bullets, who killed Marielle, is in prison. He's believed to have fired the bullets. His name is Ronnie Lesser. He's the man on the right. He used to work for Castro de Andrade's nephew, the one who was almost killed in the car bomb. So just to get back to this quote, which I think is very important, this is what happened when the initial charge, the people who were initially alleged to have carried out the murder, when it was revealed that this was a lie, this is what one of them said to journalists when from prison. What I have to say, nobody would like to hear. There is a battalion of murderers acting for money in Rio today, most of them coming from contravention. Contravention is another word for jogo do bicho. The homicide police and the head of the civil police know who they are, but they receive money from crooks not to touch or direct the investigations, thus creating a network of protection so that the contravention kills whoever it wants. Tell us in recent years, which case of murder has been the target of an investigation into contraventor? What he is saying is that there are a group of killers in Rio who are allowed to do what they want. And the reason they can do that is because the jogo do bicho pays the police not to investigate murders conducted by that group. That group would be the crime office, who are believed to be behind Marielle's killing. It's still not known who ordered the killing. And a very important person in the whole scenario, as you can see, is the man on the left, Captain Adriano. But when he saw there was a crackdown on the crime office, when Ronnie Lesser was arrested, when it appeared that all these facts were coming out, he disappeared. He went on the run. He was discovered about a year later in the north of Brazil in a state called Bahia, and he was killed. So he's now dead. He was killed. 75 police officers found him alone, cornered him, and he's killed in what's believed to have been an alleged shootout. We will never know what he knows for the moment. Why is Captain Adriano so important, even while he's dead? I'm just going to read this quote. I met Adriano in the Bopi. He gave me shooting lessons. I met him through Queiroz, who served with him in the battalion. I don't know which one, said Flavio. I've always been a parliamentarian who liked to praise the policemen who went into combat from day to day in the street for the most risky work. So what we have here is we have a politician who's saying that he received shooting lessons from Adriano. This is already worrying. This particular politician was someone who was in the Rio State Parliament in 2003, which was, in 2003, Adriano was arrested by an internal police investigation for executing someone who had denounced extortion activities he was alleged to be involved in. While he was in prison, this politician campaigned for him to be given a prize, Rio's #1 honor, which is called the Tiradentes Medal. He got the medal granted to Adriano and took it to him in prison. This politician's father then made a speech in Congress defending Adriano. This politician's name is Senator Flavio Bolsonaro. His father is Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. Not only did the family defend Captain Adriano when he was in prison, they've also been associated very closely with him in subsequent years. His wife and his mother actually worked for Flavio Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil's eldest son, while he was a state politician. I'm just going to leave it there. Just to recap, Jogo do Bicho is as important for Rio as the Cosa Nostra in Sicily. That's why I think it's so important. That's why I encourage people to read the book. If you're interested in Brazil, if you're interested in organized crime, if you're interested in the Bolsonaro family, you're interested in what happened to Marielle, and I hope the book, there's a lot of information in the book. I've tried to condense it into a short talk. So there's a lot more to read about, a lot more I could talk about, but I've tried to keep it as simple as I can. Thank you very much. And I'm ready for questions. And thank you again, David, for asking me. Thank you, Anthony and Vinicius and the Brazil Institute for hosting this book launch.
Thanks, Damian. That was very, very interesting and worrying as well. I've got a couple of questions as well to ask. Just to tell everybody who's with us here, you can just put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat, and we can go through some questions here with Damian. To start with, you talk about the Jogo do Bicho. Like you said, this hasn't really been talked about in many of the academic books or kind of books on Rio, at least to my knowledge. and it seems to run so deep, this kind of corruption, this violence within the political system and the police system. Do you have any ideas of how this can be combated? You know, of how Rio can actually move forward against this organized crime? And then the second question is, like you said about there's, you know, a vast focus on gangs, on favelas, and on violence. How does the Jogo do Bicho actually connect to that violence that, you know, gets the most publicity and the most focus from both the media and the academics?
Thanks, David. They're both difficult questions. There's no easy answer. I would say, in terms of combating the Jogo do Bicho, it's very hard to combat something that's so institutionalized. So I think the first step is to recognize what it actually is and how it actually works. It is very difficult because it's based upon a law of silence. People who talk about it are risking their lives. It's like a mafia omerta, you know, people don't talk about what happens, but at the same time, the bicheiros and the bankers and the powerful families who run it are very well known in the city. Everyone knows who they are. They have long histories, well-documented histories. I talked about the managing committee for the Jogo do Bicho called the Cupola. They've actually all received, well, there's 3 of them who are now in their 80s. They've all received 48-year sentences in 2012. They've just got such good legal teams and such influence that nothing's happened. It's been lost. So there is combating of the Jogo do Bicho, but it depends very much on political will. The reason they were allowed, they were prosecuted and given sentences in 2012, because at that time, the head of public security in Rio was someone who wasn't involved with Jogo do Bicho, wasn't on the take. And I think if we're to draw any conclusions, you have to look at what's happening now. Is anyone combating the Jogo do Bicho or not? The likelihood is that if there is no public combat of the Jogo do Bicho, that they are involved in receiving or in cooperating with that organization. So it is being combated, but how do you combat something that's so complicated, so multifaceted, and so entrenched? So that's why it's very difficult. But I'd say the first step would be to have facts in the public domain about who they are, what they do, how it operates. And that would be the very first step. So that's one thing I'm trying to do, trying to open a discussion and especially get people who care about Brazil, who think about Brazil and talk about Brazil. I'd like it out in the world and well known. In terms of the links with the drug gangs, it's a tricky one because, as I said, part of the reason I studied the Jogo do Bicho in the first place was to get away from narratives about violent gangs. I think the gangs, the power of the gangs comes from the absence of the state and the absence of any coherent policies for these communities, which are still informal. You know, they're not officially part of society. So if you have a quarter of the population of a city living in informal communities, you have to find a way to manage them. And I think the solution that Brazilian society has tragically come up with is through criminalizing them. And that criminalization is not just in the favela, it goes into the prison system, where if you come from one favela X, you are told that you belong to gang X. So the whole state reinforces this system. So that's a difficult one. There's not a direct relation between the Jogo do Bicho and these gangs that I'm aware of, although the bicheiro, the bankers, the city is divided into territories. So certain favelas will fall into the territories of certain bicheiros. And in those territories, the heads of organized crime would be bicheiros. But whether they have an influence on what goes on in the communities, I couldn't say.
Thanks, Damian. That's, yeah, a very difficult subject and how to combat it. A few questions here from the audience. Tom Pakenham asks, has there been any response from your book, from the Bolsonaro family, from the Brazilian government? I'll just do a couple of related, and then Kevin Fleming asks, he comments, really interesting book, brought Rio de Janeiro back to life for me, Saudades. And do you intend to return to Rio again in the future? And if so, do you feel safe to do that? And following on from that question, in the book, you joined a carnival school. I was just wondering whether you felt safe doing that, you know, joining that carnival school and researching the Jogo do Bicho with being so close to these, you know, criminal actors.
So in terms of joining the samba school, anyone can join a samba school, and I never felt threatened in any way as part of a samba school. In fact, I felt very welcomed because they're these wonderful institutions that happen to have, in nearly every case, organized crime acting as patrons. But it doesn't mean that the samba school itself is involved in any form of illegality. So when I was doing the parade with the samba school, I always felt very welcomed. It's something I would hope to do again at some time. But obviously I didn't walk around announcing the fact that I was writing about the Jogo do Bicho or researching it, because that might not have been so popular. But I think and that leads on to, do I feel safe in Rio? I do continue to feel safe in Rio. I travel there often. I have residency in Brazil, and I hope to go back soon. The information in the book, all of it is in the public domain. I haven't done any undercover sort of skullduggery where I've sneaked into some, infiltrated some institution and have recorded things. It's all in the public domain. I've just joined the dots. But all this is well known, well reported, but it's rarely discussed in these terms and really put together in these terms. So that's really what I've tried to do. And I've always felt safe in Rio, and I hope to continue to do so very much. I'm not aware of any response from the Bolsonaro family as yet.
Okay, and do you know why Marielle was killed, and will her international reputation have an effect on the case? And militia killings seem to be on the rise throughout Brazil in both rural and urban areas. Most victims are often young Black men. Given the well-documented links between the president's family and Rio's mafias and their militias, do similar links appear between political families and militias in other regions? If so, is there any evidence to point to whether there is a national structure of any kind, or is it a case of local groups acting independently?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So I think when people talk about the militias nowadays, these are what used to be called death squads. And, you know, as things change, names change, but the modus operandi is the same. These are groups of police and associates acting illegally in areas under the guise of combating crime, but very often involved in crime themselves, or terrorizing poor communities, carrying out some summary executions, very often targeting young men from these communities who more often than not are young Black males. So this is death squad activity, which has been going on in Brazil now for 50, 60 years. Whether it's linked to local politics, I think you have power structures in every region of Brazil. Wherever you go, or any small town, there will be power structures. So there's a very good interview given by a police officer in the documentary News of a Private War, made by João Salles and Katia Lund, which was what City of God was based on. They're the same people who made City of God. And there was a very famous police chief, Hélio Luiz, who was also famous for combating Jogo do Bicho as well. He was very hard on Jogo do Bicho. And he tells a story of going to a town in the interior, and a security guard at a supermarket beat someone. So he arrested the security guard, and he said that caused him all sorts of trouble, and he stopped being invited to the club. You know, before that, when he'd arrived in the little town, they had him in the club. He was the new police chief. Everyone wanted to be his friend. And then when he arrested the security guard for beating a petty thief, they stopped asking him. And then he says there was a murder case. And when it turned out that the murder had been committed by a influential local person, he went after that person. He was moved from the job. So you have power structures all over Brazil where local powers will expect the police to work for them. And whether that translates into a national network is more difficult to say. But the Jogo do Bicho have national reach, and it's well known that different members of the cupola in Rio have influence over different states. Not every state in Brazil, but over a substantial amount of states. It's known that certain states are run by certain bicheiros, which means that organized crime in that state will be run by that person. So that there is some, to some extent, some national networks.
Question here from Alessandro from Baltimore. He says, abraço and congratulations on the book. He asks,
Abraço, Alessandro Angelini, yeah, nice, glad you're there.
He asks, to what extent is the notion that Jogo do Bicho finances and sustains this political order, corruption, and violence as a public secret among cariocas? Have ordinary working class folks in Rio waned in their enthusiasm for the lottery in light of Marielle's murder and other links to violence and crime? What forms of cajoling and coercing people to continue to participate in the system exist?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question, Alessandro. It's a difficult question. It's not really known. I think, you know, cariocas like to pretend things aren't happening. I think it's a survival mechanism in Rio. You have to, certain things you just ignore, or certain things you imagine might happen. Certain things you also know you can't talk about. And I think one thing that's ingrained in Carioca life is you don't talk about the power of the bicheiros, really, because they are known to operate with lethal violence and have been for so long that it's just not in your interests to talk about it. It's careless talks cost lives. It's that sort of, it's exactly that sort of, I think, philosophy in Rio. So I think people making the links is more difficult. I think what we need to learn from Marielle, the killing of Marielle, the existence of the crime office, is that everything is linked. But whether most cariocas will make that sort of join the dots together, I doubt it, because it's so ingrained in popular culture. It's almost like a superstition in the culture in Rio that people will bet on animals they dream about. It's very much considered to be the people's game. And in fact, the same policeman who told me about their involvement since the beginning of the Brazilian Republic said that they use the Jogo do Bicho to hide behind, because everyone accepts the Jogo do Bicho. It's nice. Your granny plays it. Everyone has a story about, oh, my granny, she used to get me to buy Jogo do Bicho tickets. I used to take it back. It's involved in samba. It's got a whole cool thing about it. You know, the sambistas play it. Zeca Pagodinho will say, I was a bookie, one of my first jobs. So it's so instilled in people and society that to make the links that this actual mafia is something that I think will be a difficult leap to make, but it needs to be made. And also, you know, David was talking about solutions, possible solutions earlier. You can't have illegal markets that are so big with so much revenue that stay illegal without having huge, enormous risks for rule of law. They're undermining rule of law the whole time. And in Rio, what's happened is just been doing it for 120 years. But, you know, in the world, we've got drug markets, which we know undermine rule of law and fuel organized crime. I think if you're thinking about the Jogo do Bicho, it's the same thing, but it's much more nice, in inverted commas, because it's just a nice little lottery, and sambistas sing about it. So it's very difficult.
Following on from that, a bit more about Marielle. Could you tell us a bit more about her political work and positions that made her a target? And do you think her international reputation will have...
I lost you, David. I got up to international reputation. Sorry, I lost you after international reputation.
It will stop working.
Yeah, got you back.
Marielle and her political work. What made that? You know, what made her political work and her position to target? And also, do you know why she was killed? I guess that's related to that question there. And will her international reputation have an effect on the case?
Well, in terms of the international reputation, I think it did have an effect. I think what we saw was you saw a very quick attempt to create a farce And, you know, in Brazil, they'd say, well, faster, like a frame. Someone was framed. The same way I talked about the Castelinho case, the bus that was these armed robbers on their way to rob an airplane, when really it was a setup. So in the same way, they tried to set someone up for Marielle's murder very quickly. And I think that's just a standard modus operandi. I'm living in Rio, there's lots of occasions when I remember something happened or a prominent murder happened and a solution was given to it, which for me wasn't plausible. So in the same way, we saw very quickly, Marielle, there was someone found, there was a witness who alleged that he'd heard this man planning the murder. He even said he had a conversation. So I think in standard Rio activity, that would have been ready to go. You had the ready-made culprit. It was going to solve a problem because it was probably going to take someone off the streets that organized crime didn't like, get rid of so-and-so, pin the murder on him. And the very reason that fell apart was because of international pressure. If there hadn't been international pressure, that wouldn't have happened. And I think the murderers underestimated massively. They didn't expect that to happen. The people who ordered them, they didn't expect that to happen. They expected it to be a killing that would cause a minor hullabaloo in Rio, would frighten people, maybe in national press. But I think they vastly underestimated Marielle. And maybe they did so. That's moving on to the why they killed her and what her work was. Marielle was a human rights defender. She was very vociferous. She talked about things as they were, what happened. She would say, X police have gone here and committed X crime. This is what happens elsewhere. But she'd been doing that for a long time. And what's very important to understand about Marielle's murder, she'd never had a death threat. She'd never once felt in danger because of her work. And that's why I think it was a watershed in the history of the city, because people working in human rights usually did so or can do so without being threatened. It was unusual. It was unusual and unexpected, and she didn't have protection. But obviously she moved from being a human rights defender to being an elected politician. I do think that she was, whoever targeted her might have seen her as a rising star, because I think she was definitely someone who's only going to grow, only going to get more popular. She came from the grassroots. She had an amazing grassroots following, but in a very short time that she'd been in politics, she'd built up a massive following, which was part of the unexpected response, I think, to her killing. Yeah, I think, and I've covered her work from human rights defender, grassroots person, going through into politics. And I'm sure she would have gone on to national politics as well.
Yeah, difficult. Are women involved in any of these mafia type groups, or is it all run by men? And just a quick question, is your book published in Portuguese as well?
Not in Portuguese yet, hopefully one day. Are women involved in the group? Certainly. As you saw in the Garcia family, the family dispute has been between two twin sisters. I think Castro de Andrade talked about his mother, who was, he inherited his job from his mother. So yes, there have always been women involved, maybe not predominantly, but yes, there have always been women involved.
I think one last question. If anyone wants to ask any more, please do. Oh, there's just one coming actually. What do you think about Black Lives Matter in Brazil and in Rio, with the amount of violence inflicted on young Black men especially?
I think it's obviously extremely important. I think fundamentally Brazil is a very unequal society, and that inequality manifests itself obviously in racial terms. Racial definitions have changed a lot in Brazil in recent years. Now you have more than 50% of the population identifies as Black, whereas before it was much more stratified. So I think the Black Lives Matter movement is changing the way people think about lethal violence and how it operates in these communities. At the same time, it's not quite the same as the United States binary of a white police officer killing a Black suspect, because in their much larger numbers, the policemen on the front line, the military policemen, have also come from Black communities. So you're much more likely to have a black police officer killing a black suspect. But those police also die in high numbers themselves because they're the lower wage police doing the tougher and more dangerous jobs.
Yeah. Kevin Fleming here has another question. And he wonders if there are parallels with the years of violence and organised crime in Northern Ireland between the Republicans and Unionists, which eventually led to the Good Friday agreements. Do you think if enough karaokers get really tired of the situation, the endless cycle of violence killing many young black men, will they be able to reject it and force the situation to start to change? He comments maybe Marielle's murder might be a significant catalyst, or maybe he comments he's just been overly optimistic.
I think it's always important to be optimistic. And I think you've always got to hope that there will be change and things will get better. There have been peace movements in Rio. There was the Viva Rio movement, which organized the mass destruction of weapons and marches in the late 90s. But I don't really see that happening. I see a massive amount of support for Marielle and a massive desire from a large part of the population for a more peaceful city. But at the same time, it's very polarized. And you saw that at election time with, Marielle with her charisma and her energy had become a sort of icon. And you saw during the 2018 election campaign that her and Bolsonaro sort of became these opposite counterpoint figures in the city. And it was very sad to see this polarization being expressed in such a way. But there was, Marielle stencils all over the city. And then the Bolsonaro supporters would use Bolsonaro stencils on their t-shirts. So there's a lot of deep-rooted mistrust and polarization in the city, which is going to be very difficult to overcome, unfortunately.
And a question here, do you think the power of the Bicheiros waned under the left-wing government under Lula and Dilma, maybe Cardoso as well?
No. I think they've always grown more and more powerful. They're extraordinary, and to understand them is to understand so much about Brazil. There is a figure called Captain Gimarais, who he's the head of Liesa. He's almost the head of Rio Carnival. And he was a torturer in the military government. And he left. He was given an award, but he got involved in crime. He left, he got involved in jogo do bicho. He's still there today. He's still extremely powerful. I don't think he minds who's in power, really. It just doesn't matter to him, whether it's Lula, whether it's Fernando Henrique. I think they're probably quite happy that Jair Bolsonaro is in power at the moment. He seems to have aligned interests.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. What related to this, what is the path forward for international human rights groups? How are they going to work within this environment of actually trying to improve the situation?
It's a good question. It's a tough question. I think what you need at the beginning is facts. So if anyone's going to talk about human rights in Brazil, you have to look at who the different actors are, the context. It's like looking at Mexico. I'm not an expert on Mexico, but you hear this terrible news coming out of Mexico. I think where you've got illegal markets, and you've got groups fighting, disputing those illegal markets, and those groups corrupting the state and the authorities, you're always going to have violence, and you're always going to have insecurity, and it's always going to be at its worst in the poor communities. So I'm a strong advocate of bringing things into the legal sphere. You can't have illegal gambling markets. I'm British. I grew up in a country where gambling is illegal. I don't believe in illegal drug markets either. I think that the war on drugs has failed a long time ago, but I think we're still very far from seeing a change in the international conversation about the war on drugs. I mean, people talk a lot about Black Lives Matter. It's rare to hear Black Lives Matter being linked to the war on drugs and its disproportionate effect on those communities. And I think where you have high stakes and high revenues and high profits, there are always people going to want to be keeping them illegal as well, which is in the case of the Jogo do Bicho. There's a very good study by Matthew Vaz called, I think, the Jackpot Lottery. He compares the Jogo do Bicho with the numbers game in New York, and he talks about how periodically and episodically people have talked about legalizing it, and the conversation's gone back and forth, and it's always gone back to being illegal because really the people running it don't want to give up those massive illegal profits and that influence. What they exercise is enormous power and influence. There's another member of the Jogo do Bicho Cupola, Anísio from Nilópolis, and his family have been in politics for 50 years at all levels, local, state, national, and they're established. It's very difficult unless they come to the table as well one day and say, okay, we're bringing these illegal markets, we're going to open them up. But without an honest conversation, it's difficult.
Moving back to your earlier work when you looked at more cultural things, a lady called Mary has said, fantastic book, first read after maternity leave and couldn't be a better one.
That's good, thanks Mary.
And then she comments, Damian's first book was about cultural organization and how he has worked a lot with culture in Rio. The book covers key intersections of culture and crime. Could you talk a little bit more about how this occurs at other levels, especially thinking of audiovisual production across all media?
That's tricky. I'm not quite sure. In Rio, it's hard because you have these criminal organizations involved in cultural activities. So the bicheiros involved in samba, in the favelas, you have funk, which is linked to the people operating in the favelas who put on parties. So it's difficult to sometimes to separate criminal activity from cultural activity. And it's also used something that organized crime can hide behind and get involved in. In terms of my cultural activity, it's also, it's something that opens up spaces in difficult situations. So with JR, we did the Women Are Heroes project. We opened a cultural center with Afro Reggae. You're providing breathing spaces for young people. So it's also a space in any society where you can bring people together outside of politics or outside of crime. So also very good spaces for opportunity and spaces to change the way people think.
Slightly unrelated, but slightly related to what you mentioned. Comment here is, one impression that I've had is that Brazilian companies and other multinational companies in Brazil are better than companies elsewhere in the world, including trans communities in the workforce, even accepting them into senior management. Is that a fair observation?
It's not an area I'm familiar with. I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I've got very little experience of the corporate sector, unfortunately.
So a question from me, how do you think Bolsonaro is going to continue going into the next election? We see his approval ratings oscillate quite a lot. They were quite high, but they're lowering again now. How do you see that progressing until the election in a couple of years?
It's a hard one. I think there are people on the ground in Brazil who probably have a better idea, but he seems, well, COVID is quite unpredictable. It seems to have done him a lot of damage in recent months. I think he's always had a sort of 30% support base of hardcore support. I'm not sure if that's still as strong as it was, given the real mess that he's got himself into with COVID. But he does seem to be very resistant. I don't think I hope, and I don't think he will probably survive until the next election. I'm not sure, but I would be very surprised if he could stand and as well once again. I think more worrying is his support, and more worrying is the fact that his key support are the security forces, his key supporters are the gun collectors, and he's always reached out to them, and he's made it much easier to buy guns, and a huge number of firearms have been imported and sold, but both in the national market and international market. So it's quite frightening that he is influential among these sectors who are armed, and I very much hope that that won't cause, that won't be dangerous for democracy in Brazil in the future. I also think it's worrying that he is a member of a clan. He's not on his own. He has 4 sons who are all, 3 of them have elected positions, and one seems to be embarking on a political career. I think it's quite worrying to think that it's a family that might influence Brazilian politics for some time. But on the other hand, he seems to be getting himself in such a mess recently that I hope that maybe their success will be short-lived for him and his sons.
Related also to the Bolsonaro question, is there any evidence of Jogo do Bicho, visibly supporting Bolsonaro, actually real-life evidence?
Not that I am aware of. I mean, there are these uncomfortable, unhealthy incidents or episodes or facts, such as Ronnie Lesser, the gunman accused of firing the shots that killed Marielle, lived in the same gated community as Bolsonaro and one of his sons. Flavio Bolsonaro, during his election campaign, went to Linópolis and campaigned alongside the family of Anísio, a member of the cupola of the managing committee of the Jogo do Bicho. There are other politicians who would also be seen alongside that family, but that's a clear suggestion that politically, at least, they are allies.
Great. Well, I think, Damian, that's all we have time for. I don't know whether you want to ask any other questions here. Anything else you want to add and sum up, or?
No. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's commented in the chat. Thank you to all the people who've participated. I can't name everyone, but thanks so much, everyone who came along and who's listened. Thank you for people who supported the book. It's an independently published book, so I'd be super grateful if you can recommend it to people. Give it good write-ups on different platforms. But thanks for people for paying attention. Thank you, David, for helping to set this up. And thanks to the Brazil Institute as well at King's.
Thank you, Damian. We owe you the thanks for presenting that book with us today. I think it's a really, really fantastic read. It's very accessible. Sometimes I'm coming from a more academic perspective that they can be quite boring, but this is very, very interesting, really offers a comprehensive overview of the situation from a different perspective than we're used to. So yeah, thank you, Damian. Hope everyone has enjoyed that. For more events, just check out the King's Brazil Institute online and see what else we're doing. But thank you, Damian, and thank you for everybody who's joined us this afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
All the best.